"Your deafness is a liability," the receptionist said, until she saved the premature baby's life. This is the story of Sarah Mitchell, a maternity ward receptionist who faced constant hostility because of her profound hearing loss. Despite proving her competence every day, she was dismissed as a liability by her superior, Amanda Fletcher. The judgment was swift and cruel, but when a critical emergency required keen observation instead of hearing, Sarah, the employee everyone wanted to fire, became the only person who could save a mother and her premature baby from a fatal mistake. Sarah Mitchell adjusted her hearing aids for the third time that morning, trying to filter out the overwhelming background noise of Santat, Mary's hospital reception area. The devices were top of the line, cost more than 3 months of her salary, but they still couldn't completely compensate for the profound hearing loss she had been born with. Every sound came through distorted, muffled, requiring intense concentration to parse speech from the cacophony of footsteps, rolling gurneys, distant alarms, and dozens of overlapping conversations. She had learned to compensate, lip-reading mostly, years of speech therapy, careful attention to body language and facial expressions. But it was exhausting, a constant mental gymnastics routine that left her drained by the end of every shift. Sarah had been working at St. Mary's for 6 months now, hired as a receptionist for the maternity ward after a grueling interview process where she had to prove repeatedly that her deafness wouldn't be a problem. The hiring manager, Mrs. Patricia Henley, had been skeptical but willing to give her a chance. The rest of the staff had been less charitable. "Good morning, Sarah," Dr. Marcus Reynolds said as he passed the reception desk, his lips moving in that exaggerated way hearing people often used when they discovered someone was deaf. Sarah had learned not to be offended. Most people meant well, even if their attempts at accommodation felt patronizing. "Good morning, Dr. Reynolds," Sarah replied, her voice carefully modulated. She had worked with speech therapists since childhood to ensure her speech was clear, though she knew her vowels sometimes came out flat, her consonants occasionally too sharp. Another thing to be self-conscious about. The morning passed in its usual rhythm. Sarah checked in expectant mothers arriving for appointments, directed visitors to patient rooms, answered phones using a special TTY relay service, and managed the endless administrative tasks that kept the maternity ward running smoothly. It was around 11 a.m. when Amanda Fletcher arrived at the reception desk. Amanda was the head nurse of the maternity ward, a woman in her early 50s with perfectly styled blonde hair and an expression that always seemed to convey barely concealed disdain when looking at Sarah. "Sarah, I need to speak with you," Amanda said, her lips tight, her body language radiating disapproval. Sarah's stomach sank. She had learned to read Amanda's moods, and this was not a good one. "Yes, of course," Sarah said, gesturing to the small office behind the reception desk. "Should we talk privately?" "That won't be necessary," Amanda said loudly, making no effort to lower her voice despite the crowded waiting area. "This concerns your performance, and frankly, I think it's time we address the elephant in the room." Sarah felt her face flush with embarrassment. Other staff members were pausing in their tasks, pretending not to listen but obviously paying attention. Visitors in the waiting area were looking over with curiosity. "I've been reviewing incident reports," Amanda continued, pulling out a manila folder thick with papers. "In the past 6 months, there have been 17 complaints related to communication errors at the reception desk. 17, Sarah." "I wasn't aware," Sarah started, but Amanda held up a hand. "Let me finish. These aren't small errors. We had a family who couldn't find their mother because you wrote down the wrong room number. We had a doctor who missed an emergency call because you didn't relay the message properly. We had a patient who received the wrong discharge instructions because of miscommunication. Sarah's hands were shaking. She remembered some of these incidents, had tried to explain the circumstances, but Amanda had never seemed interested in her side of the story. Mrs. Fletcher, if I could explain— The explanation is obvious, Amanda interrupted. Your deafness is a liability. I know the hospital has to comply with disability laws, but there's a difference between accommodation and putting patients at risk. This is a medical facility, Sarah. Clear communication isn't optional. It's essential. I've been working very hard, too. I'm sure you have, Amanda said, her tone dripping with false sympathy. But effort isn't enough. Not in healthcare. We need competence, reliability, accuracy, and frankly, someone with your limitations simply can't provide that in a fast-paced environment like this. Sarah felt tears pricking at her eyes but refused to let them fall. She had been through this before, at other jobs. The slow accumulation of criticisms that built a case for termination. The subtle and not-so-subtle suggestions that her disability made her unsuitable, that she was a liability, that patients would be safer with someone who could hear normally. Are you firing me? Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. I'm recommending your termination to Mrs. Henley, Amanda said. She makes the final decision, but I'm confident she'll agree that this position requires capabilities you simply don't possess. Perhaps you'd be better suited to a job with less critical communication requirements. Data entry, perhaps, or filing. Something where mistakes won't endanger lives. The condescension in Amanda's voice was suffocating. Sarah wanted to defend herself, to point out that many of the supposed errors weren't her fault, that some were due to last-minute changes no one had informed her about. That the phone system was poorly designed for someone using TTY services. But she had learned from experience that defending yourself often only made things worse. I understand, Sarah said quietly. When will Mrs. Henley make her decision? By the end of the week, Amanda said. She paused, then added in what she probably thought was a kind tone. Sarah, this isn't personal. It's about patient safety. I'm sure you understand. After Amanda left, Sarah sat at the reception desk, trying to focus on her work. But her vision was blurred with unshed tears. Around her, she could sense the other staff members' discomfort, the way they avoided making eye contact, the whispered conversations she couldn't quite make out, but could imagine. Sarah, don't let her get to you, a voice said. Sarah looked up to see Dr. Jennifer Martinez, one of the OB-GYNs, standing at the desk. Dr. Martinez was younger than most of the senior staff, probably in her mid-30s, and had always been kind to Sarah. Amanda Fletcher has been trying to get rid of anyone she perceives as different for years. You're just her latest target. But what if she's right? Sarah asked, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. What if my deafness really is putting patients at risk? Is it? Dr. Martinez asked directly. Or are the mistakes Amanda cited either exaggerated or not actually your fault? Sarah hesitated. Some of them. The circumstances were more complicated than she made them sound. But some mistakes were real. I did write down a wrong room number once. I did miss a phone call because the TTY relay was malfunctioning. Everyone makes mistakes, Dr. Martinez said. The difference is that when you make a mistake, people attribute it to your deafness. When hearing employees make mistakes, and they do constantly, it's just considered human error. That's not fair, Sarah. Fair or not, I might be unemployed by Friday. Dr. Martinez looked like she wanted to say more, but she was paged over the intercom and had to rush off. Sarah was left alone with her thoughts and her fear, and the growing certainty that no matter how hard she worked, her disability would always be seen as a liability rather than just one characteristic among many. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Sarah mechanically performed her duties, checking people in, answering questions, directing visitors, all while feeling like she was watching herself from outside her body. By the time her shift ended at 4 p.m., she was emotionally and physically exhausted. She was gathering her things to leave when the emergency alarm started flashing. Sarah had insisted on visual alarm systems throughout the reception area when she was hired, one of the few accommodations the hospital had granted without argument. Red lights began strobing, and Sarah looked up to see staff members running toward the emergency entrance. A young woman was being wheeled in on a gurney, clearly in distress. Sarah couldn't hear the details, but she could see the urgency in everyone's movements. The woman was pregnant. That much was obvious from her swollen belly, and she was clutching it with both hands, her face twisted in pain. Sarah stood up, unsure if she should stay at her post or move out of the way. Hospital protocol said reception staff should remain at their stations during emergencies to manage incoming calls and visitors. But this emergency was different. As the gurney passed close to Sarah's desk, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The pregnant woman's lips were blue. Sarah had taken CPR training, had studied medical emergencies as part of her job training. Blue lips meant oxygen deprivation. And based on the woman's age, probably mid-20s, and the way her hands were positioned on her belly, Sarah suspected this wasn't just a premature labor situation. This was a medical crisis. Dr. Reynolds was leading the emergency team, shouting orders that Sarah couldn't hear but could read on his lips. She saw him say, preeclampsia, and emergency C-section, and possible placental abruption. The words sent ice through her veins. Placental abruption meant the placenta had separated from the uterine wall. It meant the baby wasn't getting oxygen. It meant both mother and child were in immediate life-threatening danger. The team rushed the woman into Surgery Suite 3, and the doors slammed shut behind them. Sarah could see through the windows as they transferred the woman to the operating table, as Dr. Reynolds and his team began the emergency procedure. She watched as Dr. Martinez joined them, moving with practiced efficiency. And then Sarah noticed something that everyone else had missed in the chaos. On the gurney the pregnant woman had arrived on, there was a medical alert bracelet. It must have fallen off during the transfer. Sarah picked it up and read the engraving. Severe penicillin allergy. Anaphylaxis risk. Use cephalosporin antibiotics only. Sarah's heart started racing. In emergency C-sections, doctors routinely administered antibiotics to prevent infection. The standard antibiotic was penicillin-based. If they gave this woman penicillin without knowing about her allergy, she could go into anaphylactic shock. In her already compromised state, that could be fatal. Sarah had to tell them, had to get this information to the surgical team immediately. She ran to the surgery suite doors and pressed the intercom button, but she couldn't hear if anyone was responding. She could see through the window that the surgery had already begun. Dr. Reynolds was making the incision. Dr. Martinez was standing by with surgical instruments. Nurses were monitoring vital signs. Everyone was focused on the procedure. Sarah banged on the door, but no one looked up. The surgery suite was soundproofed to maintain sterile conditions and minimize external disturbances. Sarah's knocking couldn't be heard over the sounds of medical equipment and urgent voices inside. She pressed the intercom button again, shouting into it. "Stop! Medical alert! Severe penicillin allergy!" But she couldn't hear her own voice properly through her hearing aids. Couldn't tell if the intercom was even working. Couldn't know if anyone inside could hear her. Through the window, Sarah saw a nurse preparing an IV antibiotic. She could read the label from where she stood. Ampicillin, a penicillin-based antibiotic. The nurse was about to inject it into the IV line. Sarah made a split-second decision. She knew hospital protocol said non-medical staff were never allowed in active surgery suites. She knew she could be fired immediately for violating that rule. She knew that bursting into a sterile surgical environment was dangerous and wrong and against every rule in the book. But she also knew that if she didn't act right now, this woman would die. Sarah grabbed the medical alert bracelet, took a deep breath, and pushed through the surgery suite doors. The effect was immediate and chaotic. Every head turned toward her. Dr. Reynolds looked up from the incision he was making, his eyes wide with shock and anger. Amanda Fletcher, who had been observing from the side of the room, gasped audibly. Nurses froze in their tasks. The scrub tech nearly dropped her instruments. "Get out!" Dr. Reynolds shouted, though Sarah could only read his lips. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Sarah held up the medical alert bracelet, her hands shaking but her voice clear. "Severe penicillin allergy. She has a severe penicillin allergy. You can't give her ampicillin." Dr. Reynolds looked confused, angry, ready to have her forcibly removed. But Dr. Martinez, bless her, immediately understood. "Stop!" Dr. Martinez called out to the nurse with the antibiotic. "Don't inject that. Check the patient's chart for allergy information." "We don't have a chart," the nurse said, looking panicked. "She came in as an emergency. No time for intake procedures." "She's telling the truth," Dr. Martinez said, pointing to the bracelet Sarah was holding. "That's a medical alert bracelet. Sarah, let me see it." Sarah rushed forward, carefully avoiding any sterile surfaces, and handed the bracelet to Dr. Martinez. The doctor read it quickly, her face going pale. "Severe penicillin allergy," Dr. Martinez confirmed. "If we had given her ampicillin..." "She would have gone into anaphylactic shock," Dr. Reynolds finished, the reality sinking in. He looked at Sarah with an expression she couldn't quite read. "How did you know?" "I saw the bracelet fall off the gurney during transfer," Sarah explained, her voice shaking now that the adrenaline was wearing off. "I tried to use the intercom, but I couldn't tell if it was working. I couldn't hear if anyone was responding, so I came in." "You violated every sterile protocol in this hospital," Amanda Fletcher said, her voice sharp and angry. "You contaminated a surgical suite, She saved this patient's life," Dr. Martinez interrupted firmly. "If Sarah hadn't brought us that bracelet, we would have administered ampicillin. The patient was already in critical condition from placental abruption. Anaphylactic shock on top of that? She would have died. The baby would have died." The surgery suite went quiet. "Doctor," Reynolds looked at Sarah, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time since she had started working at St. Mary's. "Thank you," he said simply. Then to the nurses, "Get me cephalosporin antibiotics, now, and someone find out this patient's name and emergency contacts. Sarah, you need to leave the surgery suite now, but thank you." Sarah backed out of the suite, her legs shaking so badly she could barely walk. The moment the doors closed behind her, she collapsed into the nearest chair, adrenaline crash hitting her like a truck. What had she done? She had violated major hospital protocols. She had contaminated a sterile environment. She had burst into an active surgery, despite having no medical training. Amanda Fletcher was going to use this as ammunition to get her fired immediately. Mrs. Henley wouldn't even wait until Friday. Sarah would probably be escorted out of the building within the hour. But she had been right about the allergy. The woman would have died. The baby would have died. Did being right make the violation of protocol acceptable? Sarah didn't know. All she knew was that she was probably unemployed, and that a mother and baby were probably alive because of her actions. She would take that trade? even if it meant losing everything. Amanda Fletcher emerged from the surgery suite 15 minutes later, her face a mask of cold fury. She stalked over to where Sarah was sitting and loomed over her. "My office, now!" Sarah followed Amanda to the administrative offices, her heart pounding. This was it. The end of her employment at St. Mary's, probably the end of her healthcare career. Because who would hire a receptionist fired for violating surgical protocols? Amanda sat behind her desk and steepled her fingers, looking at Sarah with an expression of grim satisfaction. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Amanda asked. "I saved a woman's life," Sarah said quietly. "You contaminated a sterile surgical suite. You violated hospital protocol. You entered a restricted area without authorization. These are all grounds for immediate termination, Sarah. Not just from this job, but potentially from ever working in healthcare again." "I understand," Sarah said. "But I would do it again. That woman would have died." "That's not your call to make!" Amanda's voice rose. "You're not a doctor. You're not a nurse. You're a receptionist. A receptionist who can't even hear properly. A receptionist who should never have been hired in the first place." The words stung, but Sarah refused to let them show on her face. She had been called worse. She had been dismissed and underestimated her entire life. This was just another person who couldn't see past her disability to the person underneath. "I'm recommending immediate termination," Amanda continued. "I'll be speaking with Mrs. Henley this afternoon. You should clean out your desk." "Before you do that," a voice said from the doorway, "you should know what just happened in that surgery suite." Dr. Martinez stood there, still in her scrub cap, her expression stern. "Dr. Martinez, this doesn't concern you," Amanda said. "Actually, it does. I'm the one who has to file the incident report. And I want to make sure we're all clear on what actually happened." Dr. Martinez entered the office and closed the door behind her. Sarah identified a critical allergy that our emergency intake procedures failed to catch. She attempted to communicate this information through proper channels, using the intercom system. When that failed, she made a judgment call to enter the surgery suite with information that would save the patient's life. I know what she violated," Dr. Martinez interrupted. "But let me tell you what would have happened if she hadn't. Mrs. Elena Rodriguez, age 28, would have been given ampicillin. Within 2 minutes, she would have begun showing signs of anaphylaxis. Her throat would have closed. Her blood pressure would have dropped. And given that she was already in crisis from placental abruption and actively bleeding, we would not have been able to save her." Amanda's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. "The baby, a girl weighing 3 pounds and 4 ounces, was delivered successfully," Dr. Martinez continued. "She's premature but breathing on her own. Both mother and baby are alive because Sarah noticed a medical alert bracelet, understood its significance, and took action when our communication systems failed her. The protocol exists for a reason. The protocol failed." Dr. Martinez's voice rose. "Our intercom system doesn't work properly for someone using hearing aids. We've known this for months, but no one bothered to fix it because we assumed Sarah would never need to communicate critical medical information. We were wrong. The system failed her, and she compensated by doing what she had to do." "She's not qualified to make those decisions," Amanda insisted. "She was qualified enough to spot an allergy that everyone else missed," Dr. Martinez shot back. "She was qualified enough to understand that ampicillin plus penicillin allergy equals anaphylactic shock. She was qualified enough to prioritize a life over protocol. I'd say those are exactly the qualifications we want in our staff." There was a knock on the door, and Mrs. Patricia Henley, the hospital administrator who had hired Sarah, entered the room. "I've been briefed on what happened," Mrs. Henley said, her expression unreadable. "Sarah, I need to ask you some questions." Sarah nodded, bracing herself for more criticism. "When you found the medical alert bracelet, why didn't you find a staff member to deliver it to the surgery suite?" "I tried," Sarah explained. "But the emergency happened so fast everyone was already in the surgery suite or dealing with other patients. By the time I could have found someone, explained the situation, and had them deliver the information, the antibiotics would have already been administered." "When you tried to use the intercom, could you tell if it was working?" "No," Sarah admitted. "I can't hear well enough to know if the intercom was functioning or if anyone inside the suite could hear me. I pressed the button multiple times, but I had no way to verify if my message was getting through." "And that's when you decided to enter the suite yourself?" "Yes. I knew it was against protocol. I knew I could be fired. But I also knew that if I didn't act immediately, someone would die. And I couldn't live with that, even if it cost me my job." Mrs. Henley was quiet for a long moment, studying Sarah's face. Then she turned to Amanda. "Nurse Fletcher, I'll need your incident report by end of business today. Dr. Martinez, I'll need yours as well. Sarah, you're suspended with pay pending investigation. This is standard procedure for any protocol violation. You'll hear from me within 48 hours about the final determination." After Mrs. Henley left, Amanda looked at Sarah with something that might have been respect or might have been resentment. "You got lucky," Amanda said coldly. "But don't think this changes anything. Your deafness is still a liability." Sarah didn't respond. She simply stood up, walked out of Amanda's office, and made her way back to the reception desk to collect her personal items. As she packed up her small collection of photos and desk supplies, she felt oddly calm. She had done the right thing. Whatever came next, she could live with the choice she had made. "Sarah, wait!" a voice called. She turned to see Dr. Reynolds approaching, now changed out of his surgical scrubs. "I wanted to thank you personally. What you did today, that was extraordinary." "I just did what anyone would do," Sarah said. "No," Dr. Reynolds corrected gently. "What you did required medical knowledge that most non-medical staff don't have. You understood the significance of that bracelet. You understood the danger of penicillin allergy. You made a critical judgment call under pressure. That's not something anyone could do." "Mrs. Henley suspended me pending investigation," Sarah said. "I'll probably be fired." "Maybe," Dr. Reynolds said. "But I'm going to recommend to the review board that you not only keep your job, but receive a formal commendation. You saved 2 lives today, Sarah. Your disability didn't prevent that. If anything, I think your disability might have made you more observant, more careful, more aware of details others miss because they're overconfident in their ability to handle situations." Sarah felt tears threatening again, but this time they were different tears. "Thank you," she whispered. Over the next 48 hours, Sarah waited at home, anxious and uncertain. Her wife, Rebecca, tried to reassure her that everything would work out, but Sarah had been through enough disappointments in her life to remain cautiously pessimistic. The call came on the 3rd day. Mrs. Henley wanted to see her in person. Sarah returned to St. Mary's with her heart in her throat, prepared for the worst. She was ushered into Mrs. Henley's office, where she found not just the administrator, but Dr. Reynolds, Dr. Martinez, and surprisingly, Amanda Fletcher. "Sarah, please sit down," Mrs. Henley said. "We've completed our investigation into the incident." Sarah sat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The investigation examined 3 key questions. Mrs. Henley continued. First, did you violate hospital protocol? Yes, you did. You entered a sterile surgical suite without authorization and without proper protective equipment. That violation is documented in your file. Sarah's heart sank. Second, were your actions justified given the circumstances? The review board unanimously agreed that yes, they were. You identified a critical, life-threatening situation. You attempted to communicate through proper channels. When those channels failed, you made a decision that saved 2 lives. The board found that your actions, while technically a protocol violation, were ethically necessary and medically sound. Sarah hardly dared to breathe. Third, and most importantly, does your deafness make you a liability to patient safety? Mrs. Henley looked directly at Amanda Fletcher. The answer to that question is unequivocally no. In fact, the review board found that your attention to detail, your careful observation, and your understanding of medical concepts were instrumental in preventing a tragedy that our standard procedures failed to catch. Amanda Fletcher's face was carefully neutral, but Sarah could see the tension in her jaw. Sarah, you're not being terminated, Mrs. Henley said. However, we are making some changes. First, we're upgrading our intercom system to be fully compatible with hearing aid technology. This should have been done months ago. Second, we're implementing new emergency communication protocols that don't rely solely on auditory systems. Third, and most significantly, we're offering you a new position. A new position? Sarah asked, confused. We'd like you to become our patient safety coordinator, Mrs. Henley said. It would be a full-time position working with all departments to identify potential safety issues, review incident reports, and develop protocols that work for staff with diverse abilities and needs. The position reports directly to me. It comes with a significant salary increase and benefits. Would you be interested? Sarah couldn't speak. She looked around the room at the faces watching her. Dr. Reynolds was smiling. Dr. Martinez looked proud. Even Amanda Fletcher had a grudging look of acceptance, though it clearly pained her. Yes, Sarah finally managed. Yes, I would be very interested. Excellent, Mrs. Henley said. You'll start next Monday. We'll have HR draw up the paperwork. And Sarah, thank you. You've reminded all of us that disability doesn't mean inability. Sometimes it means seeing what others miss. After the meeting, as Sarah walked through the hospital in a daze, she passed the maternity ward. Through the window, she could see a woman sitting in a bed, holding a tiny baby, tubes and wires attached to both of them, but both alive and stable. A man sat beside them, holding the woman's hand, his face streaked with tears of relief. Elena Rodriguez and her daughter, alive because Sarah had noticed a bracelet, alive because Sarah had understood what it meant, alive because Sarah had been brave enough to break rules when rules would have killed someone. Dr. Martinez found Sarah standing there, watching the family. They want to meet you, Dr. Martinez said. Elena woke up this morning and asked who had saved her life. When we told her, she cried. She wants to thank you. I don't need thanks, Sarah said. I just did my job. No, Dr. Martinez corrected gently. You did much more than your job. You changed how this entire hospital thinks about disability, about protocol, about what really matters in healthcare. You want to know what Amanda Fletcher told the review board? What? She said, and I quote, "If a deaf receptionist is more observant and more willing to act decisively than our fully trained medical staff, then maybe the problem isn't with her hearing. Maybe the problem is that the rest of us have stopped really listening." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. Not tears of sadness or frustration, but tears of validation. Tears of finally, after a lifetime of being told she was limited, being recognized for her strengths, instead of being defined by her differences. "Can I meet them?" Sarah asked. "Elena and her baby?" "They're waiting for you," Dr. Martinez said. Sarah entered the room where Elena Rodriguez lay in bed, her tiny daughter swaddled in blankets and sleeping peacefully in her arms. Elena looked up as Sarah approached, and her face broke into a smile of pure gratitude. "You're Sarah," Elena said. "You're the one who saved us." "I just noticed something," Sarah said modestly. "You noticed something everyone else missed," Elena's husband said, standing to shake Sarah's hand. "The doctors told us if you hadn't seen that bracelet, if you hadn't understood what it meant, if you hadn't acted so quickly, my wife and daughter would both be dead. You gave me my family, Sarah. How do I ever thank you for that?" "By living," Sarah said simply. "By being happy. By raising your daughter and telling her that sometimes the people everyone overlooks are the ones who change everything." "I will," Elena promised. "I absolutely will." "What's your daughter's name?" Sarah asked, looking at the tiny infant. "We named her Sophia," Elena said. Then she added with a meaningful look, "Sophia Sara Rodriguez, after the woman who gave her life." Sarah couldn't speak. She just stood there crying, holding this woman's hand, looking at this tiny baby who existed because Sarah had been observant, because Sarah had been knowledgeable, because Sarah had been brave, because Sarah's deafness hadn't been a liability at all. It had just been one part of who she was, and the other parts, the important parts, the parts that really mattered in a crisis, had been more than enough. 5 years later, Sarah Mitchell stood at a podium addressing the National Healthcare Safety Conference, her speech being simultaneously translated into ASL and closed, captioned on screens throughout the auditorium. "When I was told my deafness was a liability," Sarah said, her voice clear and confident, "I believed it. I had been told variations of that message my entire life. Too disabled to succeed, too limited to contribute, too different to belong. But on one critical day, my so-called liability became the key to saving 2 lives." She clicked to the next slide, showing a photo of Sophia Sara Rodriguez, now a healthy 5-year-old, grinning at the camera. "This is Sophia. She's alive because I paid attention. She's alive because I noticed details. She's alive because when our systems failed, when our protocols proved inadequate, a deaf receptionist was observant enough, knowledgeable enough, and brave enough to act." Another slide, showing statistics about medical errors prevented by diverse staff perspectives. "In the 5 years since that incident, St. Mary's Hospital has become a leader in disability inclusion in healthcare settings. We've hired staff with diverse abilities across all departments. We've redesigned our safety protocols to account for different ways of perceiving and processing information. And do you know what we've discovered?" She paused for effect. "Medical errors have decreased by 34%. Patient satisfaction has increased by 41%. Staff retention has improved dramatically. And all of this happened because we stopped thinking of disability as a liability and started recognizing it as a different perspective that catches what others miss." The applause was thunderous. Sarah smiled, remembering the day Amanda Fletcher had told her she was unsuitable for healthcare work. Amanda Fletcher, who now ran sensitivity training for hospital staff about disability inclusion. Amanda Fletcher, who had apologized to Sarah 6 months after the incident, admitting that her prejudice had nearly cost 2 lives and had blinded her to the value of diversity. Amanda Fletcher, who had become one of Sarah's strongest allies, in transforming St. Mary's into a model of inclusive healthcare. After her speech, Sarah was approached by dozens of healthcare administrators wanting to implement similar programs at their facilities. But the conversation that mattered most was with a young woman in her 20s, holding a white cane and wearing a hospital administrator badge. "Ms. Mitchell, I'm Anna. I'm blind, and I just accepted a job as a patient safety coordinator at a hospital in Oregon. They created the position because of your work. I wanted to thank you for showing us that disability doesn't disqualify us from healthcare careers. It just means we need to design systems that work for everyone." Sarah hugged her, thinking about all the years she had believed she was too limited, too different, too disabled to contribute meaningfully. "You're going to be amazing," Sarah told Anna, "because you're going to notice things that sighted people miss. You're going to question assumptions about what safety looks like. You're going to make healthcare better for everyone, not despite your blindness, but because of the perspective it gives you." That night, Sarah returned home to Rebecca and their 2 adopted children. As she tucked the kids into bed, her daughter asked the question she'd answered 100 times, but never got tired of hearing. "Mommy, tell us the story about how you saved the baby." "Well," Sarah began, settling in beside them, "it started on a day when someone told me my deafness made me a liability." And as she told the story once again, Sarah reflected on how a single moment of courage had transformed not just her life, but the lives of countless others. How what was meant to be her greatest weakness had become her greatest strength. How the receptionist everyone overlooked had become the person who changed everything. The end.